Welcome, everybody, to our third week of the Hebrew Bible in its historical setting. Tonight, we're going to begin talking about the age of the prophets. The prophets do cover a long span of time. So we're going to break this up into two parts. So we'll conclude next week with the time from the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonians all the way through Alexander the Great. And the final book of the Old Testament being written was the book of Daniel. But we'll get to that next time. So here we are. Last time we finished off with around the year 800. And just to give a little bit of a context, during this time and overlapping this time, the Pueblo culture in southwest of North America was a flourishing culture, you can almost say empire, from about the 12th century BC, 1100s BC, all the way through the 14th century AD. A long span of time. And that's the Pueblos. Do they enter into our story? Not so much. But just know that with everything that we're talking about, over in North America, there are flourishing cultures taking place. And the Pueblos were one of those that lasted a good long time. Somewhere in the late 8th century, 700s BC, we know that there was a small kingdom in Nimrud, present-day Iraq, where they have found certain earrings and a crown and rosettes from the tomb of this Queen Yabe in Kalhu, is what the kingdom was called. Those have been discovered from that time period, and they're now in the Iraq Museum in modern Baghdad. They only discovered those in 1988. So those represent some of the really early artifacts from Iraq that we now call Iraq. During this time also, we see that in the kingdom of Judah, remember by this time, Israel has been divided into the 10 tribes in the north, the kingdom of Israel, and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south, making the kingdom of Judah. That the kingdom of Judah has Jerusalem as their capital. It was made a capital during the reign of King David back about the year 1000 BC. But now during this time, Israel begins an expansion in population, in land area, and going from a relatively small, insignificant town and has grown into a major city. It has become almost a crossroads of the major trade routes from the Hittites up in Asia Minor, we now call Turkey, with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Egyptians, and places farther beyond that. That became Israel's, or I should say Judah and Jerusalem's great asset, was the fact that they are the crossroads of the ancient Near East. Now, about the year 797, Thespius, the king of Athens, dies after a reign of 27 years, and he is succeeded by his son, Agamestor. We're going to start seeing a move away from any kind of kingship in Athens and moving towards a more elected type of government. So in the 780s BC, and we'll just kind of do this by decades just to, try to keep things a little bit coherent. In 788 BC, there is a society in Sungai Batu in what is today Malaysia, and this kingdom there established this really dynamic city port and an industry of smelting iron. In Malaysia, we're talking about. We're used to hearing about iron coming from the Anatolian plateaus in Turkey and in other places, This is way over there in Malaysia, which is sort of island culture. They're able to smelt iron on a large scale, and it becomes an important trading center. And iron is really one of the most important commodities that was exported from there. And everybody wants iron because everybody is either wanting to defend themselves and so create iron weapons, or invade somebody else and the same need for iron weapons. This was known as the Old Kedah Kingdom, located there in the Malay Peninsula. Now, back over to our neck of the woods, and when I say that, I mean like in the land of Canaan and Israel. If we can look at image 1, Pastor, in 783, Shalmaneser IV succeeds his father, Adad-nirari III, as king of Assyria. Looking at the map there, pardon me. Do we have that, Pastor? There we go. You can see over there under the Assyrian Empire, up here in the, just a little bit right of center up top, there you go. The Assyrians are stretching a good long region. They are the largest empire at that point, stretching from down what is Sumer. You see that body of water down there, which is the Persian Gulf, actually. And then they stretch all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. And yeah, and as far as they reaching over there, they will eventually conquer Israel. We'll talk about that in a minute. They'll attack the kingdom of Judah. And while that region there represented isn't necessarily Assyrian-speaking people we're talking about, it certainly includes tribute states, those states that were certainly defeated and now are under the control, I'll say that, of the Assyrians. Okay, so I'm trying to find my place. Just a second, please. Sorry about this. Give me half a second. Sorry about that. Okay. So Shalmaneser now Shalmaneser IV has succeeded his father and has become king of Assyria. He is one of the first to really begin this expansion in all directions. The successors to him, and we'll talk about them, are going to be going not just towards the Mediterranean Sea, they'll be going south and southeast, and they'll even attack Egypt before it's all over with. So the Assyrians become even more aggressive than they ever were under Shalmaneser IV. Now, 782, the very next year, we have the death of King Zhuan of the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty, remember, is going to last for centuries. You probably remember that we started talking about the Zhou dynasty last time. In fact, we even were talking about them the time before. The Zhou dynasty will remain in control of that section of China. That dynasty will be in command until after the death of Alexander the Great even. These guys hang around a good long time. It's like I was telling Pastor Elizabeth beforehand. Imagine if the Zhou dynasty was in our time and they ended today, they would have begun, well, around the time of Leif Erikson, now that I think about it. They would have been lasting for this whole millennium, the whole 1000s millennium. Anyway, so King Yu of the Chao will become the next king. And also in that same time, we will have the first historic solar eclipse, and it's recorded in China. Now, had solar eclipses existed before? Yes, of course they had. They've been going on since there had been sun and moon and earth. But this is the first one that's actually recorded and understood to be what it is. That's 780 BC. The science and the astronomy of the early ages were just phenomenal. Well, Agamestor, the king of Athens that we talked about just a second ago, dies after a reign of 17 years, and his son Aeschylus, not to be confused with the playwright of that same name, Aeschylus becomes king after him. 2 years later, 776, the first Olympiad is held. Now, the history of the Olympic Games is believed to go as far back as like the 1200s, but this one is the first one that they have referred to as an Olympiad. This formal series of games, which was supposed to be acts of worship, really, to their Olympian gods. So 776, the first of the Olympiads takes place. A couple of years later, King Pygmalion of Tyre passes away. And at the same time, King Shoshenq III, the king of Egypt, has passed. Shalmaneser is now gone, and he is succeeded by his brother, Ashur-dan III. He becomes the king of Assyria, and now things start getting even more heated than before. If we look at the next image, Pastor, let me see if I can. You look at the Chao dynasty, and you see that that sort of a reddish brown section there. That is the empire of the Chao. It's not that impressive as far as area goes, as far as land coverage goes, but there are several rivers, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, several more that are intertwined in that area, and so the trading is easy for them. It's always easier to trade, over waterways than it is over land, but it's also rich in all kinds of certain clays that become great for making pottery and what's the other word? Porcelain. And all those are right there in the Chao region, and so they develop great wealth. They develop great influence. They're also great scientists. We were just talking about the first solar eclipse recorded. We're talking about also the writing that had already begun, and they had started that pictogram, that kanji that we talk about. All these things are happening in this relatively small empire. If you were to overlap the Assyrian Empire over that, the Assyrians probably cover about 2.5 times the land area. But you start getting farther east from where the Chaos are, and you're winding up in desert land. So they just didn't have much interest in being real estate developers. They simply wanted the rich, prosperous, resource-rich land that they had taken. Now, in 771, the Western Chao dynasty, which was just beyond that, and that did include some other regions that were not quite as rich, it winds up being invaded by what they called Western, not Western in the sense of European, but Western in the sense of not even Mongolians. They are more like Scythians, who would be coming from the grasslands of Russia. They wind up sweeping in, and they sacked the capital of the Western Empire, called the capital of Hao, and the king there, King Yu, is killed. His son, the crown prince, Ji Yu Ju, escapes, and he will become known as, not making this up, King Ping of the Chao. So King Ping now is the one who kind of begins the Eastern dynasty or I should say, the dynasty of the Eastern Chao Empire in China, and he's the first one to rule from a newly established capital called Changzhou. If you look on your map, that is, I think that's about where the second E is on Eastern. Anyway, couldn't find one that, there you go. Now, with King Ping firmly in place, we can turn our attention back over to Judah. And in the 760s, we start seeing some interesting characters appearing. In 768, the first of the so-called writing prophets, not all of them wrote, some of the books were written in their name with them as the characters, but still, we'll call them prophets who had books named after them. In 768, the prophet Amos, technically pronounced Amos, begins his prophetic career. He's from Judah, but his prophecy is regarding the north kingdom in Samaria, the north kingdom of Israel. In 767, we have the reign of King Uzziah. That name should sound familiar. You can think of Isaiah chapter 6, I think. Remember, he says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. Actually on June 15th, 763, the first solar eclipse is acknowledged in Babylon, and so all of the Near East, and it becomes the date by which all the chronology of the ancient Near East is fixed. You know, they are able to determine, when did King Uzziah die? Well, we know that he died, you know, this many years after this solar eclipse. And so that becomes a kind of a chronological marker or landmark along the way, that from then on, most of our dates are really very accurate. We've been able to date back before and able to name certain events as specific times, but it all is because of this singular event where this solar eclipse is recorded by the Babylonians, but then that becomes known with the whole region. The Egyptians will use that marker. The Persians will. Certainly the ancient Hebrews will as well. 763, June 15th. Now, if you look at image 3, you'll see that during this decade, there was this great temple called the Sanctuary of Hera in the Greek Isle of Argos is made. That temple was absolutely destroyed, but what was discovered and is now at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, what was discovered was the first model that was actually made. Before they built the Parthenon, before they built the what do you call it, the Pharos of Alexandria, before any of those things were built, they would make models of them first. They would measure scale. They would talk about the footprint on the land that it would have, and those things rarely survived. As it happens, this model that you see there was actually discovered. That was in a sealed, I'm going to say sarcophagus, but not in the sense of a tomb like sarcophagus, but sealed in a ossuary. That's the word I want. In this stone box where it was kept, and we don't know why they kept it. They had built the whole thing. We have the ruins. We've seen the ruins there in Argos, but it had long since been wrecked, and there were no photographs, obviously, no sketches, no anything like that. But we know exactly what it looks like because we found this model here. Like I said, it's in the museum in Athens. 762, just as that decade is about to wind down, the prophetic career of Micah begins. So you have Amos and Micah, both of them coexisting with each other. Micah is going to be a prophet in Judah in the south, and their prophetic careers will span some time, overlapping each other. In the next decade, in the 750s, Ashur-dan III, the king of Assyria, passes away, and he is succeeded by his son Ashur-Nirari V. And around the same time, Aeschylus, the king of Athens, passes away after 23 years and is succeeded by his son Alcmaeon. Around this time, Amos concludes his prophecies. Is he dead? No. He just knew that the time of his prophecies was done. He claimed not to have been a prophet or a son of the prophets, but this was something that he was called to, and there seemed to be no escaping it for him. Jeremiah would later describe it as having a fire shut up in his bones. And I've heard a lot of preachers make that reference as, oh, you know, that this word is like a fire shut up in my bones. That's not a pleasurable thing. And Jeremiah nor Amos certainly thought that being a prophet was something to be sought after. It was something that they were called to do. And with Jeremiah, and I suspect with Amos, they would have said that to not prophesy is just as painful as to prophesy. Why? Because you have to say things to people that you'd much rather be a nice guy, but they had to say what they had to say. And the warnings of Amos was to the kingdom of Israel in the north, to the capital at Samaria, and warning them about this is what is coming your way. And one of the most amazing passages, and for me, Amos he's like the Shakespeare of the Old Testament. His writing is astonishingly beautiful Hebrew. And when he starts talking about what's going to be happening to the aristocrats in the north and what's going to be happening to the shrine at Samaria, his tone and the structure of his prophecy takes on it's like a funeral dirge. So imagine being in Samaria in the north, and what you hear is a guy prophesying your doom, and he's doing it as a funeral dirge. Pretty unnerving stuff. Well, 2 years later, Alcmaeon, the king of Athens, dies, and he's replaced by a guy named Harops, who is elected not as king, he is elected as archon for a 10-year term. So now this transition is complete from the hereditary kings of Athens to now they're starting to choose. Now we're seeing the real development of what becomes Athenian democracy, where it's not a republic like we have in the US. The republic is that we elect representatives and then the representatives make the decisions. No, in true Athenian democracy, they do have a leader, an archon, the top guy, and he's elected for a long term, 10 years, but the citizens of Athens do the voting. And not like an electoral college, they will actually cast lots, sometimes to throw people out, to exile them. Here's how they did it. They would actually, to cast somebody out of the city of Athens, the citizens would write the name of a person they wanted thrown out on this small stone called an ostracos, which is where we get the word ostracize. Anyway, if you're ever on Jeopardy, you heard it from me. Now, in that same year, on April 21st, Rome, the city of Rome, is, according to tradition, founded by Romulus and Remus. The two brothers, remember I told you about them, who had been raised in the wild by a she-wolf. In fact, there's a famous, I forgot to get that, but anyway, there's a famous statue or sculpture of this she-wolf with two little guys underneath her, trying to reach up to feed from her. Eventually, Romulus, they say, will throw his brother Remus off the walls of the city, and so the name of the city is named after Romulus, Rome. It's also the beginning of the Roman Ab Urbe Condita calendar, which actually serves them very well for the next 7 centuries. In the 740s, Nabonassar becomes the king of Babylon. That happens on February 26th, 747. How do we know that? Once again, don't forget that that solar eclipse has now given them an ironclad marking point. And in the same year, Meles becomes the king of Lydia. Lydia is, I'll show you that map in a few minutes, but Lydia, it becomes this very, very, very wealthy kingdom that is on the western coast of Asia Minor, Turkey. It'll be right there on the Aegean Sea. This same year, eventful year, the city of Biskupin, which is in north central Poland, was founded, and it's the beginning of what they call the Lusatian culture. Poland now, something we haven't heard about up until this time, begins to develop a very thriving culture there and becomes kind of the target for so many kingdoms and so many empires to this present day. The Soviets wanted it. The Nazis wanted it before that. The Empire of Charlemagne wanted it. It's resource rich, and the culture was amazing. Well, that has its start here in 747 BC. In Assyria, the crown prince Pul seizes the crown and takes the name of Tiglath-Pileser III. Now we're in the major leagues. Tiglath-Pileser III and those follow him are voracious. They want everything around. And they will begin moving into Syria, moving farther south, farther than they ever had before. In 740, Tiglath-Pileser will conquer the city of Arpad after a long 2-year siege. Now, this siege, when it was done, the horrifying vengeance that the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser III exacts on these people just becomes the stuff of nightmares. The horrifying displays that they put on with the bodies of those who had been killed starts stoking up this hatred among the conquered people, who most of the time, people have been conquered. Okay, they don't like it. They'll pay their tribute. Okay. And, you wait for the next ones to come around. But under the Assyrians, especially beginning with him, Tiglath-Pileser III, people are now wanting to throw off this yoke. In the same year, Ahaz begins his reign in the kingdom of Judah, and this same time is the beginning of Isaiah of Jerusalem's prophetic career. Why do I say Isaiah of Jerusalem? Because in the book of Isaiah, the 66 books we have in Isaiah, those are not all from the same person named Isaiah. The first 39 chapters 1 through 39, represent Isaiah of Jerusalem. He's in this time period, 740. The Assyrians are the ones who are threatening. The Assyrians are the ones who are the enemy of everybody, every civilized group in the Near East. But then, after Isaiah of Jerusalem is gone, there'll be a long gap, and second Isaiah won't be until the time of the captivity in Babylon. Second Isaiah will be represented by chapters 40 through 59. There will actually be a third Isaiah who is sometimes just called a disciple of Second Isaiah, or a part of the school of Second Isaiah. And that will represent chapters 60 through 66. And that is from the time period of when the Jews are allowed to be released from Babylonian captivity under the Persian king Cyrus, called Cyrus the Great, and they will come back home. That's why it begins with, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you." That's after all those years of being in Babylonian exile, and finally Cyrus comes and lets the people go home. Because of that, the Hebrews will have a phrase called a righteous Gentile, meaning that God had used someone who was not of the house of Jerusalem, or Judah, or Israel, not from their own ancestry, not one of their bloodline, but rather one of the nations, one of the Gentiles, but a righteous Gentile. And Cyrus the Great is the first one who is given the name righteous Gentile. In Israel now, in Jerusalem, there is an institute called Yad Vashem. And in it is almost like a museum or an institute recognizing these great figures from history who helped out the Jewish people at one point or other. Sadly, one that I've always thought should have been included there, named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, has still, to this day, not been included, because they said he wasn't trying to help the Jewish people, he was simply trying to help overthrow Hitler, which to me sounds like that would have been a big help to the Jewish people. Anyway, in the next decade, in 739, Hiram II becomes the king of Tyre. And Tyre, remember, is one of those great cities, the Phoenician cities of Sidon, Byblos, and Tyre, those three principal cities. And they're city-states, basically. Hiram becomes the king of Tyre there. If we look at the next image, image 4, in 738, there he is again, Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, finally invades Israel. If you can look at the dark green part of it, he has now taken Damascus and has conquered Jerusalem, and it begins making them pay huge tribute, crushing kind of a tribute that basically takes almost all the movable treasure out of the place. During this time, Hosea begins his prophetic career down in Judah, and you can see they're still on the map down in the small, tiny, kind of yellowish there, where Judah is. Judah, yep, they'll wind up getting theirs, but not yet. But Hosea begins his prophetic career in 737 down in Judah and warning them about, look, you've turned away so many times from God, but still God brings you back. But there's going to be trouble on the way. 3 years later, in 734, the city of Syracuse in Sicily is established as a colony by the city of Corinth. Corinth is this important trading city there in Greece. That same year, Judah will fall to the Assyrians. Again, Tiglath-Pileser III. He attacks them. He just destroys so many cities, but he can't quite crack that nut called Jerusalem. He lays siege to the city, but he can't take it. Eventually, a treaty is negotiated, kind of a surrender, but a treaty is negotiated where Judah becomes a vassal state to Assyria, which means that the Assyrians will have representatives in the court of Judah, and Judah will definitely be paying lots of gold to the Assyrians to just keep them away. In 732, Hoshea, not to be confused with the prophet Hosea, Hoshea becomes the last king of Israel. Eventually, he will lose his throne and his life to a resurgent attack from the Assyrians. Down in Egypt, we haven't talked about them for a little bit. The 22nd dynasty is in place, and Osirkorn the fourth, is the successor to Sheshonq the fourth, and we have a new transition of power in Egypt, where Egypt is going to start trying to make themselves powerful again, but they're going to run into these guys that we've been talking about, the Assyrians. Down in the south of Egypt, in the Nubian kingdom of Napata, King Piye succeeds his father Kashta as the king there, and the Nubians will begin to establish an alliance with the Egyptians. And between them and the Nubians are these great archers. And so the Egyptian kingdom wants the Nubian archers to be part of their military force. And so together, they're going to think they can take on the Assyrians. Nice try. King Hiram II in 730 will pass away, and his son Matan II. Now, in 728, the guy we mentioned just a minute ago, Piye, will decide to invade Egypt. He decides he doesn't want to be allies with them. He thinks he can conquer them. And sure enough, and this is 728 BC, Piye, the king of the Nubians, moves north and conquers the city of Memphis, and actually receives the submission of the rulers all the way down to the Nile Delta. That's the end of the 22nd dynasty. Piye will establish a new dynasty in Egypt, and Piye and the Nubians are much darker skinned than the Egyptians are, and so you even start to see in paintings and in sculptures that the Egyptian pharaohs and the royal families are taking on much darker skin. Now, in 727, the next year, Babylonia decides they've had enough of Assyria, and they declare themselves to be independent from Assyria. Assyria is not going to like that. So the Assyrians are occupied elsewhere, mostly over in Tyre and in Israel and in the south kingdom of Judah. And so Babylonia now enjoys this period of independence. They're sick to death of the brutality of the Assyrians, the Babylonians are. And it's all perfect timing because the Assyrians have just started this 4-year siege against the city of Tyre. What's going on else in the world? What amounts to the 400-meter run is introduced into the Olympic Games. That was the first of the long distance running, although 400 meters doesn't seem all that long. Still, most of them had been sprints up until this time. Now they're starting to add longer distance running. What is that important about? Not a thing. Just thought I'd let you know what's going on in the world of sports. Now, in 722, in the spring and autumn period, as they call it, of China's history begins with King Ping, remember him, of the Chao, begins to reign really in name only. King Ping, I can't say that name enough. He becomes a figurehead that it becomes almost like, think about King John, where the nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede Meadow in England. In the same kind of way, King Ping is now, and I'm sorry that I won't be able to say that name anymore after this, but that he's been forced to submit to basically a council of nobles. The Chou dynasty will exist for another 500 years, but the real power is residing with the noble families. At that same year, the same year that China undergoes a bit of a revolution, the North Kingdom of Israel is basically flattened by the new Assyrian king named Sargon II. 2 years later, the Assyrians end the siege of Tyre, and now as the war, they're called a stele, a tall stone that it's spelled S-T-E-L-E. That is a commemorative stone. It says that the Assyrian troops had washed their spears in the sea. That's one of their favorite phrases. In the 710s, King Huan of the Chou becomes the next ruler, but remember, not quite so impressive as it had been before. The kingdom of Lydia in 718 is beginning to grow in its wealth, and in fact, there will eventually be a king, and we're not going to talk about him for another 200 years, 150 years. A guy named Croesus. You've heard the phrase sometimes, as rich as Croesus. Well, he was one of the kings of Lydia, and he has so much wealth. Why? Because there are silver mines in the region and gold mines also in the region, and so if you've got the mines, you know, mine it and make coins out of it. They have found coins, Lydian coins, that were pretty impressive make. King Sargon II, the Assyrian, has now moved north against the Hittites and conquers the Hittite stronghold at Carchemish. That stronghold, Carchemish, is going to be playing a very big role 100 years later. It will wind up being the last stand of the Assyrians. So this fortress that they capture, they're going to expand on its fortifications, and that will be the place where they hold out. But Sargon decides to create a new capital for Assyria at a place called Dur-Shurukin. The Assyrians will wind up moving their capitals several times by this point. In 716, the next year, the Roman legend has it that this is the date that Romulus ended his rule in Rome. Alba Longa is gone, and Rome now is beginning to grow, and Romulus has led his people in some expansion. After Romulus is the first true king of Rome, and his name is Numa Pompilius, and he will reform the Roman calendar, and he will create a new office for himself, of course, the office of Pontifex Maximus. What does that mean? It means high priest. That phrase, Pontifex Maximus, will become one of the most cherished and jealously guarded of all the offices in Rome. Eventually, and I'm skipping way ahead, under the Roman Emperor Augustus, he will take for himself 3 titles. Imperator, which means basically commander-in-chief of the army, and that's where we get the word emperor. But he'll also call himself Princeps, which means the first citizen. And he'll call himself the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the state of religion. So way down the line, when the Christians come along and they refuse to acknowledge Caesar as the high priest of their religion, then the Romans think that it's treason. So it's not just this difference of religious opinion. As far as the Romans are concerned, to worship any god besides the Roman gods is to defy Caesar. Well, in the last decade of the 700s, we start seeing Spartans begin to expand. The Spartans were there in the Peloponnesus Peninsula of Greece, and these are the guys that you see so many football teams named after the Spartans because they were the great warriors. The Spartans never contributed really much of anything to, not to law, not to art, not to philosophy. The Spartans were just warriors. They were the greatest warriors of the ancient world. In fact, you've probably heard about when the Persians were invading Greece, that 300 Spartans went out and held what they called the hot gates, because there was a hot spring near there. It was called Thermopylae, and they wound up holding off this invasion force of the Persians that, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, there was like 1 million troops, but no. There's probably like 200,000 soldiers, but then many other auxiliary forces, and even families of the soldiers who would sometimes travel with them. Still, 400 holding off 200,000 is pretty impressive stuff. The Spartans now began expanding their colonies and even move over to a place called Tarentum. In modern day Italy, it's called Taranto, into southern Italy, and begin expanding Spartan influence there, this beginning in 706. The next year, the worst of the bunch of the kings of Assyria comes to the throne. His name is Sennacherib. You see him mentioned in the Bible, and Sennacherib was fierce. He moves the Assyrian capital to Nineveh. Nineveh will play, of course, a large role in the book of Jonah, where this was a massive city, and it will become, at one point, the largest city in the world. That won't last very long, but still. Sennacherib moves there, and Sennacherib finishes off everybody. In 701, only 4 years after Sennacherib comes to the Assyrian throne, in 701, King Hezekiah of Judah, backed by the Egyptians and the Nubians, will revolt against Sennacherib. And Sennacherib descends on Judah in force. He sacks so many cities, and that's when the prophet Micah begins describing the destruction of those so many towns in Judah. Around the same time, in the north, the Scythians start settling and slowly replacing those that would be what we would call the Caucasus region of Russia now. And the Scythians are these great horse warriors with horse archers and great cavalry, and so they're fast, they strike fast, strike hard, and they begin moving south. The same year, it's the end of the Villanova culture in northern Italy and the rise of what we call the Etruscan civilization. The Etruscans wound up with two different, I guess I'll say alphabets, and one was called Linear A, the other was called Linear B. And this was the most difficult text to translate. I mean, it was more difficult than hieroglyphics. It was more difficult than cuneiform. It was so difficult because there was not that many things to compare it to in order to find, common letters. For example, when Napoleon's army was in Egypt and they found the Rosetta Stone, on that stone was 3 different levels of writing. There was hieroglyphics, then there was Greek, then there's the Dorsetic writing. And so Francois Champollion, who was only 17 years old when he started the process, began looking for, okay, what is the most common Greek letter that occurs? Well, let me see what I can find that is the most commonly occurring hieroglyphic. It only took him 16 years to crack the first letter. But when he did, then everything else began falling into place. Imagine the determination and the commitment to stay at it for, especially being a kid of 17, to stay at it for 16 years and finally crack the first letter. Well, of course, he wound up being a hero. But all that to say, with so little representation of linear A and linear B, it was very hard to finally break those. They weren't linear B was broken first, but linear A wasn't even broken until the 20th century. Long time. So where was I? Oh yeah, the Villanova. So the Villanova culture is past, and it's the rise of the Etruscans. If we can look at the next image, image 5, Pastor. In 700, the Upanishads, a sacred text of Buddhism, Hinduism, was written around this time. And there it is, the famous, like a ball batted back and forth, a human being is batted by two forces within. That's one of the great slogans of the Upanishads. It sounds a lot like Paul. Paul talks about the war of our members going back and forth between us. The Hindus were coming to the same conclusion. In 699, we have a beginning of the Elamite Empire. The Elamite Empire is trying to think if I had a. Nah, I don't think I do. Anyway, the Elamites are kind of down towards where Sumer used to be, but on the other side of the Euphrates River. The Elamites will start to grow. They're not really looking at expansion, because you've got the Persians to your east, you've got the Assyrians to the far north, you've got the Babylonians to your immediate north. They are just looking for a place to pitch their tents. Still, they'll get noticed, and their Elamite empire won't last all that long, really. In 797, another Chao king comes to the throne, King Huan, and they will actually go through 3 different kings within this decade of the 690s. King Sennacherib in 691 will then turn his attention to Elam, that I just mentioned about, and at the Battle of Halule will defeat the Elamite king Humban-Nimena. Humban-Nimena was not looking, like I said, to expand. He was just trying to establish trade routes for themselves. They started making some money off their trades. Well, Sennacherib wants it. And Sennacherib doesn't want any threat on any of his borders, even though Elam never considered itself a threat nor wanted to be a threat to them. Sennacherib won't have it. In 690, Taharqa is a king of the 25th dynasty, sorry, and he will come to the throne. And from them, if you will look at image 6, there is this Sphinx that was made of him. It's now in the British Museum in London, and it was actually made in tribute for him. That's supposed to be his representation. That's supposed to be Taharqa himself. And it was made for him by the Nubians, who were trying to form an alliance because they had been thrown out of Egypt. In 689, remember I told you that Babylon had looked to move out from underneath Assyrian rule. Well, back comes Sennacherib, and Sennacherib sacks the city of Babylon all over again, like it happened 160 years before. And Sennacherib is once again reconsolidating the empire that he had inherited. if we look at the next image, Pastor, in 687, Gyges becomes the king of Lydia. And so on this map, you can see where I'm talking about, that Lydia is that orangish area where you've got the Babylonians are to the south, but never mind them yet. But there on Lydia is the whole western half of Asia Minor, or modern day Turkey. They have, like I said, all the silver, all the gold mines in there. And yeah, they become amazingly wealthy. The cities on the coast become very important trade centers, because all of the goods from Lydia can be taken to these coastal cities and then traded with the emerging kingdoms in Italy, and with the established kingdoms in Greece, and also along the coast of Asia Minor. Remember, Carthage had already been founded by this time, and they become a huge trading partner with the Lydians. So Hezekiah now becomes the next king of Judah, succeeding Manasseh before him. And Hezekiah is one of those known as one of the good kings of Judah. There weren't that many, but Hezekiah is one of them. Hezekiah decides to centralize Hebrew worship again, and he tries to get rid of so many of the shrine sites that had cropped up all over Judah. He is trying to centralize worship under a central priesthood and temple there in Jerusalem. The Chows, we'll go through another couple of kings during this time, and finally, thank goodness, Sennacherib dies in 681. Well, not so fast, because Esarhaddon becomes the successor to him, becomes the next king. Esarhaddon isn't going to be as much of a conqueror as he's going to try to consolidate the Assyrian Empire. He'll fight against Arab tribes who lead rebellions. He will advance as far as the Nile River in Egypt. He will begin rebuilding Babylon, because Babylon had been sacked, remember, under his father. And Ashkelon, which is over in one of the Philistine cities, is Ashkelon leads a revolt against Esarhaddon. They're supported by the guy we just saw the Sphinx of, Taharka. And so Esarhaddon puts down that Philistine revolt, and then he launches his first invasion, and that's against Egypt, to kind of punish them for aiding in Ashkelon's revolt. So the Assyrians invade Egypt, but Taharka is actually able to keep them on the eastern side of the Nile River. So the Nile again becomes the great fortress for Egypt and stronghold for them. In 737, Tullius Hostilius, there's a name, Hostilius. He becomes the king of Rome. Hostilius, where we get the word hostile. He was that kind of a guy. He begins creating I want to say almost a tyranny. He becomes a tyrannical king in Rome. 2 years later, 671, Esarhaddon again invades Egypt. This time, he captures the Nile Delta. He captures the capital of Memphis. He captures the ancient capital of Thebes. And as part of it, he captures most of the royal family and carts them back to Assyria. The next year, 2 years later, in 669, Esarhaddon passes away, and his son Ashurbanipal will become the king. We have an image that's one of the cool things from Assyria. Assyria, again, they create libraries, and in fact, they will create a library that will house the Epic of Gilgamesh that we've talked about. But one of the coolest things that the Assyrians did was this relief sculpture, it's called. It's called relief because it's not like a three-dimensional standalone figure. Rather, it's carved out of the wall. You can see the flat wall behind it, and then this relief is carved out of that stone. So is it three-dimensional? Yeah, but it's not standalone, and it like comes out of the wall at you. That relief sculpture, they called it bas-relief, is fantastic. That is supposed to be Ashurbanipal himself, leading what he called himself, the king of the world, not like that kid in the Titanic. Yeah, it was a pretty fair attempt at it. He will become a great leader, a successful conqueror, and will eventually, in this same decade, take the entirety of Egypt. I mean, everything of Egypt will fall under him. But one of his half brothers, Shamash-shum-ukin, is the son of, remember, Esarhaddon, becomes the king of Babylon. Then Egypt decides to revolt against Assyria, and Nineveh, by this time, the largest city in the world, which before that had been Thebes in Egypt. Now it's Nineveh, largest city in the world, and Ashurbanipal launches yet another attack on Egypt. At this same time, a city is established between Turkey and Greece on what's called the Hellespont, or the Dardanelles, and a city is established there called Byzantium. Byzantium will later have its name changed to Constantinople, and then after that, in 1543, changed to Istanbul. So that city is founded by the colonists from Megara in 667. 3 years later is the first naval battle recorded. It's between the city-state of Corinth, this great city, this great trading city, and Corcyra. And the two of them have established these great fleets that were usually used for trading, but they decided that if they fit the front of the ship with like a ram, that you crash that into another ship, you know what? It'll go down. So the early strategies of naval battles is ramming. Later on, they'll decide that we can use things like arrows, or arrows dipped in oil and set on fire, hit the sails with that, hit the rowers with that. It works out pretty well. They will even develop this stuff they will call Greek fire, naphtha, which is launched from like a small catapult onto other ships, and it strikes the ship, spreads out, and sets the ship on fire. But the first naval battle, 664. Now, down in Egypt, Ashurbanipal has, like I said, completed his sack of the place, but he hasn't overthrown the whole monarchy. The Egyptian pharaoh Psammetichus I will become the king of Lower Egypt, and remember, Lower Egypt is down towards the Mediterranean Sea. And Taharqa will appoint his nephew as his successor in Upper Egypt. So you've got the Egyptian empire now divided into north and south, thanks to Ashurbanipal and Sennacherib before him. On February 11th in 660, it is the founding of the nation of Japan. February 11th, 660 BC, the Emperor Jimmu becomes the first emperor of Japan. There had been invasions from China. And so what you have in Japan are basically, sometimes they actually refer to them as black and white Japanese. It's actually those who are more of Chinese descent and those who are more, I'm going to use the word aboriginal, those who are more native to Japan. Those of Chinese descent will have certain features about them, including a lighter skin, and the more aboriginal ones will have like broader faces, and their skin will tend to be darker. Like happens in every culture, you know which one is oppressed. Truth be told, even in modern day, did I hear something?
That those Aboriginal type Japanese actually originated in Korea, and so
they did, but
yeah.
But way back before this, yeah, they had actually those Koreans had, which is so funny, Chuck, because you know the Koreans and the Japanese are almost genetically identical, and yet there's a real animosity between them for sure. And yeah, the more aboriginal Japanese certainly had come from the Korean peninsula and had migrated over there, oh goodness, millennia before then. And so the Japanese now have created a nation. And it's, as far as they're concerned, an empire with the establishment under Jimmu, the emperor, sorry. Now, yeah, now we need image number 9, I think. Here is the first use in 660 BC. The first use of what's called demotic script. The Egyptians, nobody wants to do hieroglyphics anymore. Nobody, some of them, it's been supposed that they don't even know how to do hieroglyphics anymore because of the different influences from the Hyksos that we talked about, those foreigners who had invaded Egypt and had taken over for a while, between the Assyrians, between other influences, that it would be easier to create a script, which they did here, and be able to use that for trade documents with other nations. So here's and this is actually the second language that was on that Rosetta Stone: the hieroglyphics, the Demotic, and the Greek after that. Now, at that same time, Psammetichus I drives the Pharaoh of Egypt, drives the Assyrians out of Egypt. Pretty impressive stuff. To drive the Assyrians out of any place is pretty phenomenal. That same year is the year of that impact crater called the Kaali crater that really changed climate around the world. That happens the same year. Was it somewhere close enough that the Assyrians could have seen it as a sign? No, it wasn't close enough. They barely recognized anything was happening. Still, a remarkable geological event. In the next decade, in the 650s, the Spartan Creed is written and by the Greek poet Tyrtaeus. And in this Spartan code, it talks about what it means to be a Spartan citizen. To be a Spartan citizen means to be a Spartan warrior. And the Spartans create this warrior culture that it's like the Klingons. I mean, it's all about honor and serving the state and serving the Spartan city-state. In the Spartan Creed, there is the famous line from every mother Spartan mother who's sending her son off to war, the famous line, "Come home with your shield or on it," meaning don't run, don't flee battle, that you either come home carrying your shield with you or they bring your body back lying on your shield. There's a famous story about the Spartans where they began taking young boys about the age of 7, 6, and would take them into these Spartan camps, and they train them in weapons, they train them in stealth, they train them in every kind of thing that a warrior is going to need, and they also train them in taking pain. One story that, whether it's apocryphal or not, still represents the Spartan training and the Spartan lifestyle, is one boy was hungry and had gone out at night and decided to steal a chicken. So he is taking the chicken back to the barracks where the other boys are, and as he's on his way back, he's spotted by 2 of the elders who are making their rounds at night. So he actually puts the chicken between his legs underneath his tunic and holds the chicken tight, and the Spartan elders, of course, know that he's up to something, so they're going to interrogate him, and they keep interrogating, and he doesn't say anything. He doesn't give away anything. Eventually, and it's dark, they lower a torch that they had been carrying, and they see his tunic soaked in blood. He falls over dead because the chicken had actually pecked its way into his liver, and he never said anything. Now, if that's a true story, I don't know, but certainly the Spartans love to tell that story to show that, yeah, they can put up with anything. That is really the beginning of the myth and legend of Sparta. About this same time, in the 650s, way over in Guatemala, we have the occupation of the Mayan site at Piedras Negras over there. Pardon me. The Mayans are beginning their expansion over in Central America. In 657, Cypselus becomes the first tyrant of Corinth, and tyrant actually becomes an official title. It's not a description about somebody who is a tyrant. No, the tyrant is the one who, think of dictator. They have absolute control, especially over the military. But in Cypselus's case, he also controls trade as well. Now, down in Egypt, Psammetichus is still retaking all of Egypt from the Assyrians. Not only from the Assyrians, he's reunifying the North and South Kingdom, that is to say, Upper and Lower Egypt, and also taking control over the Nubians to the south. With him ends the 25th dynasty. A couple of years later, the Elamite kings began to start rising up again. Having been smashed by Sennacherib, they're once again trying to reassert themselves because it looks like the Assyrians are starting to get theirs. Things are starting to go against the Assyrians finally. The kingdom of Cush begins to rise up again after the collapse of the 25th dynasty in Egypt, and Babylonia once again rises up in revolt against the Assyrians. All right, so you've got the Elamites starting to rise up. The Egyptians have pushed the Assyrians out, and now we have what's his name? Altnarsea is beginning to move north out of the Cush kingdom. The Babylonians under Shamash Shum-Ukin begins pushing against the Assyrians also. And in 652, the beginnings of a group in Persia who will be known as the Achaemenid dynasty. And from them, we will have such rulers as Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, and all the others. 652 is when they began their rise. 100 years later, Cyrus the Great will wind up conquering everything in sight. Now, in 650, there's a climate change that takes place. And we start to see that these Bronze Age cultures in Europe start undergoing colder and wetter climate. So much so that the Scandinavian Nordic Bronze Age tribes are pushed south down into the European continent. So those that had been so far up in Sweden and Finland and Norway began moving farther south into Denmark, but also into northern Germany and northwestern Russia, what we would call Russia now. Imagine going to a place, I mean, being so cold that actually Russia is warmer. Yeah. So now they began moving into the European continent and will have a large effect, bringing their Bronze Age culture with them. Now, in 640, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal will establish a library. And in that library will be our earliest complete copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. That very copy has been discovered with the unearthing of the library's library in Nineveh. They find what Ashurbanipal, with all of his ferocity, with all of his aggression, will actually do this one thing to benefit humanity. Next year, 649, the Elamites began to rise again. The Babylonian insurrection is crushed by the Assyrians one more time. The Greeks will, and this is in the year, actually, it's April 6th, 648 BC. The Greeks will chronicle their first solar eclipse. And in 647, King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, actually the second, will attack the Elamite city of Susa and wreck it. It was a gorgeous city. It was the object of admiration and jealousy of all the other cities around. And eventually that city will be rebuilt and become a cultural capital for the Persian Empire. Ancius Marcius in Rome will become the king there. And at the same time, 641, 642, a young king will come to the throne in Judah named King Josiah. Josiah will be one of the great kings of Judah and will start what becomes known as the Josiah Reform, where they discover in the temple a second scroll of the law, which of course becomes Deuteronomy, which means a second law. They say they found it. Josiah believes that this is something that has been stored away and lost in the temple. And so Josiah begins this reform based on the law, because basically they had lost the Torah by this time. Were there fragments? Yes, but there wasn't any great system of a legal system, a religious legal system, until the finding of the law. Finally, in the next year, image number 10, Pastor, in 640, it's a decisive victory of Assyria over the Elamite Empire, and Ashurbanipal actually captures, there you see Elam, down you see Susa, down there near the Persian Gulf. There you go. And what was I saying? Oh yeah, they captured the last king, Kuma Kaldash III, and Assyria annexes the country of Elam into the Assyrian Empire, but it's almost not even an annexation. It's more a complete destruction. They lay waste. That was recorded, lay waste, recorded by the prophets, recorded by, I'm talking about the Hebrew prophets, recorded by the Assyrian steels, recorded by the Babylonians. They all talked about what vengeful ferocity the Assyrians heaped upon the small kingdom of Elam. That same year, no, that's not right. In 639, 639, yes. Oh, I think I have an image for this. I do. Image number 11, Pastor. That is the Acropolis in Athens. And in 639, Cylon, who was an Athenian noble, seizes this hill, this Acropolis in Athens, and tries to become the king of Athens again. No more of this Argon stuff. He wants to be Archon. He wants to be the king. He winds up being defeated, but the Acropolis represents the seat of authority for the Athenians. And on that Acropolis, although when he seizes it, there's not that much of it there, but you can see all the different things that were eventually built on that hill in the center of Athens. There would be the temple of Athena, called the Parthenon. There would be the Stoikos. There would be all these things that were built there, so that the Acropolis will become not only the political center of Athens, but the cultural, even to some degree, the religious center of Athens. Over in China, same year, the Chinese kingdom of Jin and her allies are beginning to make their expansion, and they defeat the kingdom of Chu. But we'll hear from them again. In 631, in Cyrene, remember, you'll hear that name again, a guy named Simon of Cyrene, the guy who helps Jesus with the cross. The city of Cyrene is established as a Greek colony in Libya, modern-day Libya. And around the same time, 631, Sadietes becomes the king of Lydia, that kingdom I showed you on the western coast of Asia Minor. This same time, Zephaniah begins his prophetic career. And Zephaniah will begin talking about what the Assyrians are doing, especially in regards to Elam, and that surely God must be going to punish them at some point. Well, in 630, remember, we're still during the time of King Josiah. In 630, we see the earliest prophecies of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah will prophesy for many years, 45 years, I suppose, and there will be a period where he doesn't prophesy. Now, with him is a scribe named Baruch, who is one of my favorite minor characters of the whole Bible. He's just the scribe. I don't mean to say just, but he's the secretary of Jeremiah. Jeremiah doesn't write down the prophecies, Baruch does. And at the end of the story, jumping ahead to the end of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah is taken off into captivity, Baruch doesn't know what to do. But the word of the Lord comes to Baruch, the book of Jeremiah says, and he says, "Where will you be safe? There is no place to be safe. Egypt isn't safe. Israel isn't safe. Judah is not safe." And he says, "Yet I will give your life as a prize of war. I will give you your life." And so Baruch always has this sense that, yes, the Lord will look after him and will ensure his reputation, Fame, not so much, but reputation, yes, as being this faithful scribe. On the next image, image 12, is my favorite archaeological discovery of all time. We have no writing, nothing of the original Old Testament. We don't have anything original of the New Testament. But this century, or sorry, in the last century, the 20th century, they found this, which is a seal over a clay jar. Inside the clay jar would have been scrolls sealed up. When they found this in this cave, the jar had been broken open and the scrolls were not there, but they found this seal. And this seal says, the scroll of Baruch, the son of Piltah. Of all the things that were lost, in a really odd way, Baruch is given his fame and his notoriety and his reputation, and it's the only writing that we have from an original author. Baruch wrote the scroll of Jeremiah, absolutely, and this, by all estimation, would have been sealed up by Baruch because the Lord actually told him to write it, seal it up, put it away. He followed orders, and Baruch lives on. Well, in the 620s, then finally, Ashurbanipal II dies. He is succeeded by Ashur-etil-ilani, and and Babylon in 626, the next year, under Nabopolassar, the city of Babylon will revolt against Assyria and will establish what comes to be known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or in the Bible, we see it referred to as the Chaldean Empire. The Medes will begin to assert their independence along with the Babylonians from Assyria. And they will, in 625, will make their first attack on the city of Nineveh. The Assyrians now the rule would be passed on to a very unsuccessful ruler named Shin-shar-ishkun, and he will take over from his brother that we just mentioned, Ashur-etil-ilani, as the king of Assyria. And in the next year, 622, is when the text of Deuteronomy is discovered in the Temple of Jerusalem. And this is when Ezekiel is born. Ezekiel is born during this time, and he will begin his prophecy in the near future. In 619, we have a new king in Lydia who begins making pushes against the Assyrian kingdom to his east. So the Assyrians are in huge trouble now. An insurgent Babylon, an insurgent Median Empire, Babylon being the Chaldeans, and in 614, the city of Ashur, which had once been the capital of Assyria, is conquered by the Medes and the Babylonians. During that same time, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus becomes the king of Rome. Rome will have a period of several kings, 10 kings, I think, and eventually Rome will decide that kings are not the way to go. But under Tarquinius Priscus, Rome begins expanding and taking over more from the Etruscans in Italy. The Chals are undergoing a weakening, but still not ready to be toppled yet. And in 612 BC is when the Medes, the Babylonians, the Elamites finally conquered the city of Nineveh. That city, which had been the largest city in the world, that city which was known as the great capital of Assyria, that city, Nineveh, may actually have been the site of the Hanging Gardens. We always think of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but recent archaeological evidence has said, don't think it was there, because Nineveh had been referred to by the Assyrians as the New Babylon. And so when they built this Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and Nineveh is the spot where the Hanging Gardens could have existed, not really so much in the city of Babylon proper. Anyway, so now that Nineveh is knocked off, the Assyrians are forced into headlong retreat. Sin-shar-ishkun, the king of Assyria, was killed in the sack of Nineveh, and now Ashur-uballit II tries to keep the Assyrian Empire alive. And he goes back and he establishes himself as the king of Haran. Remember Haran, that's where Abraham, when he had left Ur of the Chaldees, had gone up north following the Fertile Crescent, stopped off in Haran. Well, that's where Ashur-uballit establishes his kingdom. He's pushed out of Assyria. He's not in Assyria. The Medes and the Babylonians and the Elamites have conquered Assyria. He has just tried to establish this one last stronghold at the place called Carchemish. Remember, I mentioned that a minute ago. And they're going to try to hold out there. That same time, so many of those from Nineveh had been deported there or taken captive there. They all run for Babylon. And now in 612, Babylon has become the largest city in the world, taking its place from Nineveh. But now down in Egypt, a second pharaoh, or another pharaoh, named Necho II, succeeds Psammetichus I as the king of Egypt. And Necho decides, you know what? The best way to consolidate my power is to make an alliance with the Assyrians, and because they desperately need help. So I'm going to go up there, help them, because the Medes and Babylonians and Elamites, the coalition, is coming against them at Carchemish. So Necho starts to move north. Over in Judah, King Josiah, that great king, decides that what he has to do is to slow Necho down, keep him from joining up with the Assyrian forces, because the Judah wants an end to Assyrian rule. They want they want an end to Assyrian domination. And so Josiah sees this as the great moment. In 609, as Necho is moving north, Josiah intercepts him at a place called Megiddo. It was such a cataclysmic battle that Megiddo becomes the watchword for a world-changing event. Much later on, we're going to have another word that comes from that, Armageddon. Even in the time of the writing of John's Revelation, and we're talking about 700 years later, still Megiddo carries with it the sense that this is a change of front for the universe. So Josiah goes out and meets Necho in battle, and Josiah is killed, but he did what he set out to do. Necho was never able to join up with the Assyrians. By the time he was able to get to Carchemish, the Assyrians had already been defeated by the Babylonians. They had captured Haran, they had captured Carchemish, and Ashur-uballit, the last Assyrian king, disappears from history. There won't be anything left of Assyria after that. At that same time, Habakkuk, the prophet, begins his prophecies. And Nahum, the prophet, Nahum, in his prophecies is celebrating the fall of Assyria. Well, who wouldn't be? But in Habakkuk, it's a really odd turn. You look in the first chapter, and Habakkuk is talking to Yahweh, And he was like, you know, we want to be delivered from these Assyrians. These Assyrians are just too much. And God responds to him and says, okay, but I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, those hasty people. And he basically tells him, you haven't known trouble until you've seen these Babylonians. Well, sure enough, that's exactly how it's going to turn out, because there will be a king named Nebuchadnezzar who is going to come looking for Egypt, and I mean for Israel and for Judah. Well, Josiah is dead, and his son Jehoahaz takes over, but Necho, on his way back to Egypt, having not made it to Carchemish in time, he stops off and he deposes Jehoahaz and puts his brother Jehoiakim, that is to say Jehoahaz's brother Jehoiakim, in his place. Jehoahaz was the rightful heir of King Josiah, and Jehoiakim was a bit of an idiot. And that's exactly who Necho wants on the throne, because now Israel, or Judah, the kingdom of Judah, is going to have to pay tribute to Pharaoh Necho. Well, after Carchemish is over with, Nebuchadnezzar will become, who's actually the crown prince of Babylon. He's not the king yet. Nebuchadnezzar will wind up heading down into Egypt and will defeat the army of Pharaoh Necho. So now the Babylonians have conquered Assyria and now have chased the Egyptians down through Syria, down through the kingdom of Judah, and will move on Egypt itself. Nebuchadnezzar becomes known as the destroyer of cities. In his record, his military annals, he conquered over 70 major cities. I'm not talking about towns and villages, 70 major cities. He is the conqueror of the Middle East. He's actually Nebuchadnezzar II, and he will succeed his father, Nabopolassar, as the king of Babylon. And in 601, he'll make an alliance of Medes and Scythians and finish off all the land once held by the Assyrians. In 600, over in India, they've been prospering very well. There are 16 great kingdoms who rule in India, from the Kasi to the Kosala to the Anga to the on and on and on and on, 16 of them. So India is flourishing very well, and I only mention that because we haven't mentioned India since we talked about the Upanishads just a minute ago. In 600, also, the city of Milan is established by the Gauls, or the Celts, who had come from Galatia in Asia Minor. The city of Marseille in France is founded by the Phocians, a Greek city-state, who had started their maritime expansion also. In 600, the city of Smyrna is sacked and destroyed by the Lydians. And also in that year is the year that had been proposed that Nebuchadnezzar, finishing his rebuilding of Babylon, some say he built the Hanging Gardens during that time, but now we have our doubts, with reestablishing his control in Egypt, now reestablishing his control over Israel, getting tribute from them. Now he is consolidating his empire. In the next century, and we'll go there next week, Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, will decide to revolt against Nebuchadnezzar. And Jeremiah will tell him, don't do it. Whatever you do, don't do it. This guy doesn't play around. Funny thing is, the people will say, but we have the temple. How can God let anything happen to his temple? Well, the prophets will have plenty to say about that. So next time, when we come back, we'll talk about the Babylonians' conquest of everything in sight. and the eventual deportation of Jews to Babylon, the period known as the exile. So many prophetic careers going on during that time. Jeremiah is still around, still prophesying during this time, and will only reach a crescendo of prophecies during the time of the first decade and a half of the 500s, and then go on with Cyrus the Great and the Persians, and finally Alexander.